No mai, haere mai. Welcome to the Maxim Institute podcast. My name is Jason, and I'm the Communications Manager at Maxim Institute. This is our weekly short-form podcast. These podcasts are released in tandem with our weekly column and are a chance for you to hear in depth from the column's author about some of the thinking that went into producing their final piece. Today we talk to Director of Research and Development Marcus Roberts about his recent column. Marcus, welcome back to the podcast.
Hi, Jace.
Always good to have you for a chat. We're talking about your new column this week, the Global Gloaming. And in this column, you make the point that over the last 60, maybe even 70 years, since the end of the Second World War at least, we have been in this period of, or maybe after the end of the Cold War particularly, we've been in this period of kind of increasing peace and prosperity, and that we've kind of come to see this as how the world should be. Yep. Yet that's not how it should be, is it?
Well, maybe it is how it should be, but not how it necessarily is. Yeah, that's right. So that's right. So one of the things I was reflecting on was growing up. I'm a child of the 80s, but really I didn't know anything about the Cold War. It ended before I was really following these sorts of things. And so what have I grown up with? I've grown up with peace, no chance of war touching New Zealand shores. Obviously, we've got into wars, but that's been our professional military, all volunteer force, and those were wars that weren't existential for New Zealand. And I've also grown up with a world of prosperity, and that my everyday needs are met. Starvation is not a threat for New Zealanders. Whereas in historical times that you look back on, peace and prosperity is not the norm. In fact, it's the rare exception. And so I worry that we have grown up thinking that what we've experienced is just the natural state of things.
Like you and I were talking earlier about some periods of history that are noteworthy because there was no conflict.
Yeah.
So we talk about them as this great time because it was peaceful.
Yes.
But it wasn't like the norm.
They're noteworthy because they're
the exception.
The exception. Yeah, that's right. So the idea that actually great power competition, or just competition between states generally, being worked out through military conflict or competition, maybe not leading to war, that's just how things worked. That's not great. But if we are worried about how we interact in such a world, we have to be clear-eyed about the fact that it exists. And that we can't just expect things to continue on the way we've been lucky enough to have growing up.
Yeah, and you talk about this in terms of, or the context of the incoming government, whoever they may be and however that may be made up, just hoping that they that they realize they have to navigate this world. Yeah.
I think that's right.
The first step is acknowledging reality.
Yeah, that's right. And that reality. So what is that reality? That reality, I think, is a global world, or what's known as the shifting world. That's what New Zealand Foreign Affairs and Trade talked about in its latest strategic policy assessment, which you can find online. But what they say is that we are being dragged into a multipolar world. So we've grown up with a world where we had USSR and America as the two superpowers. The USSR collapsed, so you're left with America as the sole superpower.
Yeah,
that's no longer the case. You've got challenges to that American hegemony.
China popping up all over the globe.
That's right. Yeah. China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, in different ways are challenging that American hegemony. So we're having a multipolar world. And the thing about a multipolar world is that how do you determine who is top dog? Hard power, military power, the use or the threatening of military power. And unfortunately, that's not a world where the UN or some multilateral body is necessarily going to sort these conflicts out. We're already seeing that.
The UN is, like you've said previously, a voluntary organization where that people, in a sense, sign up to agree to be bound by their rules and their resolutions. And if they don't want to,
well, who's going to make them? Exactly. So it almost works by moral suasion and force. But if people don't buy into that, then they can just turn around and say, well, how many divisions does the UN have to?
Yeah. And I guess in an increasing pluralistic world, that's more and more likely, isn't it? That not everyone's going to see things the same way. And so there'll be more and more of this, well, so what sort of attitude.
That's right. The UN was built in a particular period of time by the victors of the Second World War. So why do we continue to give it any credence? So that's the one aspect of the shifting world. The second aspect is where economics is increasingly filtered through the prism of military security. So this is talking about what's known in the US as friend shoring.
Okay.
So onshoring some things, some manufacturing, specifically away from China.
Yes.
But also if you can't do it in America or it's too expensive to do in America, you put it to one of your friends, Mexico or Vietnam or something like that. Hopefully New Zealand.
Yeah,
we don't have a manufacturing base. So
something for the new government to work on, maybe.
Something to work on, exactly. And then finally, that economic efficiency, that just-in-time economic system we have is less prized than resilience and sustainability. So what happens if there's a global pandemic?
Yeah.
Do you have the ability to make your own PPE, for example? So that all is quite concerning for a small nation in the middle of nowhere with zero military capability and reliant on free trade.
And maybe without the ability to survive in isolation.
Yeah, I think so. Or we've lost that ability to survive in isolation. That because we're part of this interconnected global world, we rely on overseas fertilizers, for example.
Yes.
So this is all, the idea is that works fine when you have a system of government around the world where piracy is kept under control, where free trade is something that's seen to be a good, and that you have a navy, the US Navy, which is willing and able to protect the sea lanes. If you no longer have that, which I worry the 21st century we're going to see less and less the US Navy being able to do that or willing to do that, then where does that leave New Zealand?
So what are some things that we can do then to maybe prepare ourselves or set ourselves up for at least some form of success in the future?
I think waking up about it, just being aware. That's really what I wanted to do in this column. Will our new leaders be worrying about these? I certainly hope they're worrying about what's happening in the world, and also articulating that concern for us, because I think we've really internalize this idea that peace and prosperity, we don't have to work for it. And it just will continue if we just leave it.
But we have to maintain it and guard it and protect it. And I guess the question is, what are we willing to sacrifice for that?
Yeah, that's right.
What will we lay down in order to keep our prosperity?
Yeah, or to keep our independance. We talk about our independent foreign policy. Well, what are we prepared to do to ensure that our independence full stop is continued? We used to spend, for example, during the Cold War, more than twice what we currently spend on defense, for example.
Yes.
But all sorts of things like that are going to have to be relooked at. How sustainable are we economically? How self-sufficient are we? Should we be doing some more friend shoring? Should we be getting closer to our friends? AUKUS is in there. That submarine deal with Australia and America, that's being and England are being talked about. Can we join that? Should we join that?
Yeah. So all these little things that we can do to try and shore up, I guess, our historic allies, and ensure our survival and maybe even thriving in the next century.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, maybe not turn back to necessarily what worked in the 20th century, but at least recognizing that the 21st century, I think, is going to be a dangerous place. We're entering the gloaming, the twilight. That's why I called it that. So it's not overly uplifting, but
but very realistic and hopefully something that will wake up our politicians to the reality of it. Marcus, thanks for being with us.
Thanks, Jason. We are still a week away from finding out the final shape of the 54th New Zealand Parliament. It will probably take a little longer for the coalition negotiations to be concluded and for Christopher Luxon to be sworn in as our 42nd Prime Minister. However long its formation takes, it is clear that the new government's list of priorities will be long. Crime, the economy, an infrastructure backlog, health and education will all be on that list. But the incoming Prime Minister needs to write at the head of that list the Harold Macmillan quotation, "Events, dear boy, events." Because the world is thick with events. Almost all of them are concerning. Here's a sample of international headlines from the last few days. The US has reiterated that it would honour its treaty obligations to defend the Philippines after Chinese and Filipino ships physically collided. 24 US service members were injured in attacks on US bases in Iraq and Syria. A ground invasion of Gaza by Israel has begun. A second US aircraft carrier has been directed to the Middle East. A wave of military coups have erupted in West Africa, in Niger, Burkina Faso, Guinea, Chad, Gabon, Mali. The Caucasus are simmering dangerously. Chinese aeroplanes continue to test Taiwan's air defense identification zone. The war in Ukraine has now lasted over 600 days, and despite static front lines, shows no sign of stopping. This is the shifting world that New Zealand Foreign Affairs and Trade warned about in its latest Strategic Foreign Policy Assessment. According to this assessment, we are being dragged unwillingly into a multipolar world in which hard power is more important. Economic relationships are increasingly filtered through the prism of military security. And economic efficiency is less prized than resilience and sustainability. This is a dangerous world to be a small, isolated trading nation. New Zealanders younger than 40 have only known a time of peace and prosperity. We grew up after the fall of the Berlin Wall and enjoyed the peace dividend that followed. Our defence spending as a percentage of GDP is now half what it was in 1990. We've been able to nestle comfortably under the USA's security blanket while enjoying the luxury of railing against it. But the world which we have enjoyed over the last 3 decades is entering its twilight, and our new Prime Minister will have to lead us into the gloaming. Our crucial first step as a leader will be to shine a light on geopolitical reality. The peace and prosperity we have recently enjoyed has been historically unprecedented. Instead, what has been more common for most nations in history was articulated 2,400 years ago by the Greek historian Thucydides. The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. It is a bleak message, but one we need to face up to if we are to do anything about it. Will our new leaders be up to the challenge?
Thanks for listening to the Maxim Institute podcast. If you'd like to hear more from us and keep up with the rest of our research and analysis of politics and policy in New Zealand, you can sign up on the homepage of our website to get our monthly forum email and invitations to future Maxim Institute events. You can search and subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, or wherever you get your podcasts. From the team at Maxim, mā te wā, goodbye for now.